March 30th, 1994, on the rich and peaceful Oseny Boulevard in western Moscow, a car explodes in a massive fireball. 2 girls were injured, and one of them would pass away in the hospital. The intended target, Andrei Isayev, aka Rospis, one of the top-ranking mobsters in Moscow, was unharmed. Despite the unintended casualties, the killer didn't care. This was just a typical Wednesday for a humble railway inspector who had transformed into one of Russia's most dangerous hitmen, Alexei Lvovich Scherstobitov, aka Lyosha Soldat, Lyosha the Soldier. Today we're telling the story of one of Russia's most unique hitmen who came up during the wild 1990s, who was brought into the criminal life by force, and later on tried to escape the life despite being a notorious hitman. Let's get into it.
Charlie Dogwood.
The year is 1993. Russia's economy is collapsing and suffering from an inflation rate of over 1,000%. Among the millions of impoverished Russians is Alexei Scherstobitov. He had a family background in the military and had been set up to become a high-ranking officer. He had even been given an award for capturing a dangerous criminal and seemed set for a career in the Soviet army. Instead, the Soviet and now Russian army had fallen into pieces, so he became a railway inspector, but soon he was forced to leave. His short-lived business ventures that he tried afterwards were all set on fire by competitors as well. He needed money for his new wife Olga and his newborn daughter. At a certain point, it shifts from what you will do for money to what you won't do for money, so he took on whatever work he could get. In his few free moments, Alexei would train for powerlifting at a gym at a former bunker transformed into a gym creatively named Bunker. The gym was a meeting place of 2 men, president of the Powerlifting Federation and head coach of the Russian national team, Sergei Ananyevsky, aka Kultik, and ex-KGB lieutenant, Grigory Kusyantinsky, aka Grinya, or Grisha Severny. This pair was also joined at the gym by butcher Andrei Pilev, aka Karlik, and his older brother, Oleg Pilev, aka Sanich. This group of 4 men led by ex-KGB lieutenant Grisha Severny would form the central leadership of the Medvedovskaya gang that focused initially on extorting business owners in the informal markets in and around Moscow. Alexei Scherstobitov didn't have money to enter the gym typically, so he was let in for free. In short order, Grisha Severny had scoped him out and brought him on as a bodyguard of sorts. Soon, Scherstobitov was given a task by Grisha Severny: take a package of weapons to a wooded area and hide it. Scherstobitov did so without question, but in reality, this was an old KGB ruse. The following day, Grisha Severny called Scherstobitov to let him know that the package of guns had went missing. Now Alexei owed him big money, and if he tried to run, the gang knew where his wife and daughter lived. The group was well known as leg breakers and worked over many businessmen, so a housewife and an infant weren't exactly the people you wanted to leave in their custody. It would have been a relief at first when the ex-KGB officer let Scherstobitov know that he didn't want the money. Instead, he wanted the sharpshooter Scherstobitov to eliminate someone for him, or rather, for the gang's new boss. You see, in early 1993, the Medvedovskaya gang had merged under the underworld kingpin Sergei Timofeev, aka Sylvester, becoming known together as the Orekovo-Medvedovskaya organized crime group. Timofeev had long been a fixture on the Moscow gang scene since the mid-1980s, gradually working his way up to become the king of shell games, car theft, and other illegal ventures in the south of Moscow during the final years of the Soviet Union. Though arrested in 1989, by 1992, the kingpin was out on the street again, and had become the king of the new Moscow underworld. In a short time, his gang had conquered territory all over Moscow, and had begun to demand tribute from most illegal and many legal ventures in southern Moscow. By the time Grisha Severny and Kultik decided to bring their organization under the umbrella of Timofeev, Sylvester, named so because of his muscularity in reference to Sylvester Stallone, had moved into taking control of banks, even placing his Jewish wife that he used to obtain Israeli citizenship as the head of the Moscow Trade Bank. However, Timofeev was not entirely reliant on his own muscle for power and derived much of his strength from his allies and friends. The mafia boss Japonchik, who I did a video on before, two of his young heirs, Rospis and Petrik, or Lenya the Sly, major Georgian gangster in Moscow with deep political and business connections, Otari Kvantrishvili, Russia's first used car salesman and oligarch, Boris Berezovsky, and head of the Solontsevskaya gang, Sergei Anatolievich Mikhailov, aka Mikhas. In short, the people allied with Timofeev were basically a who's who of major criminal figures in Moscow. But in addition to these allies, Timofeev relied heavily on moving militant. Grisha Severny and Kultik both liked violence as well, so they assimilated well into Timofeev's gang. In 1993, the only real opposition to Timofeev were the Chechen gangsters and the so-called quote-unquote Caucasian gangsters who Timofeev took a hard line against alongside his two friends, Rospis and Petrik. While some Georgians could be counted among the Slavic gangsters' allies, some had angered the Slavic gangsters who saw the Caucasians as irresponsible and foreign. In 1993, the only downside to joining Timofeev's enterprise were the Chechens, who were unified and incredibly violent, so they punched far above their small size.
Человек с хорошим чувством юмора, крепенький, такой очень решительный. Можно сказать, даже дерзкий в рассуждениях. Все очень спокойно, все очень логично. Доводит до тебя быстро, лаконично. Слушает.
But as intelligent as Timofeev was, he was also ambitious and quick to anger. It's for that reason that a simple insult from a former cop that he had recruited into his own team, Mikhail Fomin, aka Filin, had signed his own death warrant. That death warrant ended up in the hands of Grisha Severny, which then flowed down to Alexei Sherstobitov. At first, Grisha Severny handed Sherstobitov an ancient Nagant revolver with a silencer, essentially putting the man on a suicide mission. But Sherstobitov was able to convince his new boss that he needed a new weapon, cycling up to a 1937 model Moisin Nagant cavalry rifle, then onto an AK before settling on overkill, going for an RPG-18 anti-tank rocket launcher, which apparently you could just get your hands on back then. But killing a man was one thing. You still had to escape and avoid getting arrested. Sherstobitov planned, observed his target, and planned some more. He designed a disguise for himself, even going as far as collecting cigarette butts from public places and dropping them around the sniper's nest that he had made for himself across from the assassination site that he had chosen. Meticulous and sometimes over-the-top efforts to conceal his identity became the hallmark of Sherstobitov, with him leaving false prints and having a whole wardrobe worth of disguises for him to use, ranging from wigs to fake beards. He even placed other people's hair in his balaclava mask to confuse investigators. By the time he left the gangster life behind him, Sherstobitov had become one of the most careful hitmen in the Russian Mafia's history. May 5th, 1993. After about 2 months, Sherstobitov readied up, heading to his makeshift sniper's nest. It was across the street from a construction site of a new club that Filin had been overseeing, no doubt hoping to become a big-time club owner. As the target returned to his car, Sherstobitov readied himself, and as soon as the target and his bodyguard slammed the door shut, the missile fired. It was a direct hit. The missile flew through the front of the windshield and out the back, leaving Filin and his bodyguard missing some fingers and hair, but otherwise just fine. It was only luck that kept him alive, both the target and Sherstobitov. Timofeev thought that the missile attack was enough intimidation, even though it missed, and so the matter was put to rest. Not long after, Grisha Severny, a notoriously violent boss to his own men who had already ordered one of his men executed for popping a champagne bottle and accidentally hitting him, had another conflict within his circle. Igor Yurkov, aka Udov or boa constrictor, was taken out from a shot fired far away at a construction site. Sherstobitov and another man dressed as a construction worker were behind the killing. Soon after, 2 others close to Udov were also killed by Sherstobitov. Now he had become Lyosha Soldat, a hitman in the Russian Mafia, working under Grisha Severny and Kultik, inside the king of Moscow's criminal underworld's network. Money, power, and success all awaited him. Timofeev would have had much use for a man like Lyosha Soldat. By 1994, his expansion was starting to cause problems. He started taking over banks and soon refused to honor payments to Boris Berezovsky, picked fights with the Solontsevskaya gang, and had expanded into the oil business, putting him in direct competition with Otari Kvantrishvili for control of the Tuapse oil refinery. Even worse, he picked a fight with Japanchik. Japanchik had moved from Moscow to New York City and had his own strange criminal network in the New World while retaining links back to Moscow. During a visit to the US in 1993, Timofeev and Japanchik got into a fight, enough so that Japanchik began considering killing Timofeev. Things had begun to break down for Timofeev, and he had picked a very dangerous opponent to fight with. Now seemingly without any allies in the world, Timofeev gave the orders to begin attacks, and Lesha Soldat was going to be the tip of the spear. Since the earliest days of the wild 90s, Rospis had been at war with the Caucasians and the Chechens, and had a close connection to Timofeev from this conflict. But now the two were enemies. Rospis frequently moved from place to place in those days, having barely survived a sniper attack in the year prior, so it took some time to track him down and plan the attack. March 30th, 1994, on the rich and peaceful Oseni Boulevard, a pair of schoolgirls played. It was a nice neighborhood, filled with well-to-do people in the new Russia. Among them was Rospis. Lyosha Soldat watched from afar as the two girls played outside by the car of Rospis, having tried scaring them away earlier. It was of no use. When Rospis and his bodyguard arrived at the car, Lyosha Soldat didn't hesitate. The car exploded in a massive fireball, killing the bodyguard of Rospis and one of the little girls. The other girl was forever disabled by the attack, but Rospis was uninjured. Rospis would flee abroad and go underground, eventually ending up dead in 1997 in Poznan, Poland. In spite of the lack of success, the effect was still the same. Rospis was taken off the board, and the declaration of war against other gangsters had been well received. Less than a week later, on April 5th, 1994, another attack would occur. As noted Georgian gangster and close ally of Boris Berezovsky and the Kremlin, Otari Kvantrishvili exited the Krasnobrenenskaya Banya, along with a wrestler friend of his named Mikhail. A shot rang out. Kvantrishvili sunk to the ground. A second shot popped Kvantrishvili in the throat. As chaos erupted around him, a third and final shot hit him in the head. He was dead. Kvantrishvili had been a close friend of Boris Berezovsky, and through him possessed a deep connection to President Boris Yeltsin, who was a personal friend of the gangster Kvantrishvili. Now both men had lost a major criminal connection and friend. Whoever did this had kicked up a hornet's nest, and the government was desperate to find the killer. The killer seemed untraceable, with no witnesses or fingerprints, even leaving behind their sports shooting Anschutz rifle behind, clean of any evidence. However, the killer made one big mistake. Cigarette butts left at the scene. The police chased their tails for several months afterwards, trying to find whatever evidence that they could find, but it just wasn't there. Lyosha Soldat had succeeded again. For his hard work, Grisha Severny helped Lyosha Soldat upgrade his 2-bedroom apartment into a 3-bedroom, and even gave him a raise. But he was in danger. By shooting Otari Kvantrishvili, Timofeev had declared war on Boris Berezovsky and even the Kremlin, with Boris Yeltsin sending out a public telegram of his condolences to the Kvantrishvili family. It was April of 1994, and the friends that had helped Timofeev rise to power had all been turned against him. Japanchik, Rospis and Petrik, Mikhas, Boris Berezovsky, and even the Kremlin somehow. In spite of all of this, Timofeev still pushed forward. Kremlin-associated oligarch Boris Berezovsky was to split 100,000 with Timofeev, and he never split the pay with him. Between Berezovsky's connections to Timofeev's enemies and this business dispute, Timofeev decided to take out one of Russia's greatest oligarchs and handed the job to Lyosha Soldat. The operation was to go down big and in public. Lyosha Soldat and former powerlifting coach Kultik loaded up an old car with explosives and set it outside a building owned by Berezovsky's Logovaz. From a distance, Lyosha Soldat watched as Berezovsky's car drove by. In a moment, Kultik yelled something over the radio, and Lyosha Soldat could see Berezovsky from his scope. Without thinking, he flicked the switch. A massive explosion followed, crumpling the car and perforating Berezovsky's car with shrapnel. The bodyguard who had been riding with Berezovsky had sheltered his body from the explosion. Berezovsky was torn to shreds, but had survived. From Timofeyev's mindset, getting rid of Berezovsky would complete the process that killing Kvantrishvili had started. By getting rid of the two top Kremlin-aligned figures, it was his hope to affect national politics, either to sever the president of his connections and force himself onto Yeltsin, or simply to weaken the president, or maybe just to make himself so powerful that the president couldn't touch him. After all, in 1994, Russia's president was so beset by power struggles that Yeltsin had barely been surviving. Getting rid of Berezovsky may have necessitated that Timofeyev be left alone by Yeltsin in the Kremlin, or else taken into his court of allies out of recognition of the gangster's power. But Berezovsky survived, and now they were in big trouble. Timofeyev couldn't just be grabbed by the police. It's Russia in the 1990s after all. But there were other ways of hurting him. The media was whipped into a frenzy. Yeltsin released a public statement against the attack on an innocent businessman like Berezovsky, and the top FSB anti-terror cop, Alexander Litvinenko, had been put on the case. By the end of the week, militarized police burst into the Moscow Trade Bank, detaining the top executives as well as Timofeyev's wife. She was let go soon after, and a bank associated with Berezovsky was bombed. A few weeks later, armed police raided a property in Moscow, capturing several gangsters connected to Timofeyev, including ex-KGB man and lieutenant Grisha Severny, as well as a lesser-known figure, Alexander Butorin, aka Zomb. Zomb was the younger brother of the much more well-known Sergei Yurievich Butorin, aka Osya. The pair had come up as armed robbers, focusing on expensive works of art, and had ended up being absorbed into Timofeyev's crew. Osya and his bodyguard, Marat Polyansky, had moved up fast in the hierarchy. Those two weren't captured, but during this time became important members of the gang because of their love of violence. At the raided property, the police found a small arsenal in addition to numerous guns on each gangster. The arsenal had been stolen in a robbery of a firefighting school out in Siberia, and during the crime, the robbers had killed a guard. For a sum rumored to be around about $1 million or more, Timofeyev paid to have Grisha Severny and his driver taken out of jail. Alexander Butorin would remain behind bars. September 13th, 1994. Near the Chara Bank headquarters, a man on the phone got into a Mercedes-Benz. An explosion echoed out onto the busy street, killing the driver instantly. Sergei Timofeyev, aka Sylvester, had been killed. Despite how public the killing was, there was no real attempt to find out who took out the one-time kingpin of the Russian underworld. There were just too many possible suspects. Berezovsky, someone close to Ivankov, Mikas, the Chechens, Sergei Butorin, aka Osya, or even perhaps the Kremlin. In fact, the number of gang boss deaths in the early 1990s was so large that it led to the creation of a myth about an underground army of vigilantes called White Arrow. Regardless, there was no attempts to get back at whoever had just killed Timofeyev. Things among Timofeyev's old outfit were quickly reaching a boiling point. The sudden death of Timofeyev had not just removed many sources of income, but had also thrown the whole organization into disarray over the succession. Timofeyev, not being a real king, never had a real succession plan put in place. Grisha Severny, Koltik, Osya, Sergei Volodin, aka Rakon, Dmitry Belkin, aka Belok, were all prepared to fight to control what remained of the once dominant crew. The heir apparent, Grisha Severny, fled Moscow for Kiev, well aware that it was too dangerous for him in the city, since he trusted no one but Lyosha Soldat. There in Kiev, down in Ukraine, Grisha Severny built the beginning of a new enterprise, getting involved in weapons smuggling and the oil industry down there, dipping his toes into the different criminal enterprises available to him in Kiev, and using his gangster friends and the Obshak of the OPS to wage little wars against local Ukrainian gangsters. Eventually, however, the two Pilev brothers, both of whom went back and forth from Moscow to Kiev amid the tense atmosphere, refused Grisha Severny any more money. According to Oleg Pilev, aka Sanich, it was Grisha Severny's old friend Koltik who finally gave the order to kill the ex-KGB agent. As the story goes, one of the businesses that he had tried to get into was controlled by the Ukrainian security services from behind the scenes. It was too dangerous to go to war with them. January 25th, 1995, Grisha Severny arrived at his apartment and sat down in a chair by the window. He picked up his phone to call his brother, and the two chatted for a moment. Then a gunshot rang out. Grisha Severny would die a few days later in the hospital. On his tombstone there is a poem. Joy is a rare occurrence, like a morning murmur of spring, and instead of rotting on branches, I'd rather burn out in the wind. Real poetic for a sick bastard like Grisha Severny. The killer of Grisha Severny had left the sniper rifle in the attic and his sniper's nest across the street. But other than that, the information left behind by the killer was limited. For years, people figured that local gangsters had been behind the hit, but years later, it would be revealed that it was in fact Lesha Soldat. Grisha Severny had been killed by the man he made into a gangster. For killing his former master, Lesha Soldat had his salary doubled and was allowed to recruit a small team of men to work under him. Despite this, his refusal to live large or hang around at gangster parties meant that he was virtually unknown in the Russian underworld. He liked it that way. Lesha Soldat had one vice, and it wasn't living high on the hog. Anyway, back in Moscow, things were a total mess. By 1995, the gang had settled into being led by 4 men: Koltik, Osya, Sergei Volodin, Drakon, and Dmitry Belkin, Belok, without any shooting. Yet, in the background are the 2 Pylev brothers, Andrei Pylev, Karlik, and his younger brother Oleg, Sanich, remained active and grew in influence each day. Karlik fostered the image of a tactical mastermind and financier. His brother Sanich just killed to kill people, and that's exactly what he did. The gang had long relied on drug addicts in their ranks. It was easier to control heroin junkies than normal psychopaths, but with Timofeev gone, they just felt like they couldn't trust them anymore. The 2 Pylev brothers quietly killed dozens of members of the gang, who were either alcoholic or addicted to heroin. Most of them were intentionally overdosed or were drowned in lakes with concrete shoes. Now the madmen were in control of the asylum, and from 1995 to 1996 alone, Osya and his direct team were involved in some 57 murders and attempted murders of other gangsters, as well as the murder of a witness in an attempt to protect his younger brother, Zomb, from prison. They needed men to kill, and Lesha Soldat was there to be used. But he wasn't the most enthusiastic killer for them. He refused certain attacks or bombings against figures on occasion. He always had his reasons. To make up for the lack of effort from Lesha Soldat, Osya hired an ex-marine with a violent streak, ironically nicknamed Sasha Soldat, who would become an infamous hitman in his own right. He was twice as bloodthirsty, but half as careful. But none of the gang leaders even seemed to care. In 1995, however, the biggest news piece about the Mafia wasn't the bloodshed, but the escape from the infamous Matryoshkaya Tishna by hitman Alexander Solonik, aka Alexander the Great. Solonik had been the main hitman for the Kurgan gang, originating from the creation of 3 literal gravediggers turned gangsters in the city of Kurgan. Since 1993, the gang had been in Moscow working for Timofeev, but it was growing fast, and it was just as dangerous despite their small numbers. It was either Osya or the Kurgan gang's leadership who paid about $500,000 to a prison guard to assist in Solonik's escape. We aren't really sure. After his escape, Solonik fled abroad, taking the guard with him, settling down in Athens. The guard ended up dead, but there in Athens, Solonik lived with a beautiful model girlfriend in a villa paid for by Osya, occasionally flying back to Moscow to do hits. It was also around this time, however, that Osya, who was rapidly becoming the head of the outfit, began to have trouble with the Kurgan gang. He dispatched Lesha Soldat to Athens to do a job for him. Lesha Soldat bugged Solonik's telephone, and when they listened back to the conversations that Solonik was having with his fellow Kurgan gang members, demanding that they finally kill Osya and the 2 Pylev brothers, it sealed his fate. He had also let it slip that longtime gang notable, Koltik, had made preparations to switch sides to the Kurgan gang. In March of 1996, Koltik was shot dead in central Moscow, in front of the US Embassy. Less than a month later, Drakon joined him in the afterlife after a shootout with a hit squad. Now the gang's leadership fell under the total control of the soldier turned robber turned gangster, Sergei Butorin, Osya. Just as the others, he was violent to a fault, and didn't seem to care who knew it. Dmitry Belkin and the two Pilev brothers fell in behind him. However, in spite of all this news about Salonik, Russia was keen on turning a corner on this gangster stuff. The Russian police began a crackdown, issuing warrants for the arrest of Osya. Osya, not really wanting to end up behind bars in Russia, took the short way out. He was given a lavish burial by the other gangsters despite his short time ruling over the gang. Or that's what he wanted the police to think. Osya had faked his own death and received plastic surgery. He was the first major Russian mobster to attempt this, ending up abroad in Spain alongside his longtime bodyguard, Marat Polyansky. Around this time, Spain was becoming a Russian mobster hotspot, and soon Osya would be joined by other mafia bigwigs. Among them was Karlik, who acted as the financial brains of the gang and manager of the Obshak. His younger brother, Sanich, was the muscle and continued to lead the gang in person in Moscow. At last, after some time, they were able to get around to killing Salonik in 1997. For reasons that are unknown, Lyosha Soldat was not called up for the job. Instead, it was Lesha Soldat who led a team of men into Salonik's villa. They held him down, and the notorious shooter, Salonik, was strangled by Lesha Soldat while his girlfriend was forced to watch on. Salonik was dumped onto the side of the road. His girlfriend's dismembered remains were discovered in a suitcase several days later. Lyosha Soldat instead helped with the killing of a witness who had helped them get a fake Greek passport. His body was discovered buried in a forest outside of Moscow. And yet still, the killings continued. Some were almost random, and others were the result of the still common disputes in the criminal underworld. Regardless, it brought heat. The one thing that Lyosha Soldat hated. A bombing at a cafe orchestrated by Lyosha Soldat killed a bystander and injured two others. Another mistake, and even more heat from both the cops and his intended targets. Not long after, he found yet another reason to get out. A woman named Irina. Lyosha Soldat had met Irina some years prior and had fallen in love, carrying on a secret love affair. However, the violence surrounding him at the time scared Lyosha Soldat. Fearing that Irina could end up dead because of his work, in 1995 he broke it off with her. In 1997, however, he couldn't hold it back anymore. Fresh off the Salonik situation and killing a dance club owner named Iosif Glotster for a business owner named Alexander Tarantsev on the orders of the Pilev brothers, Lyosha Soldat broke down and tried to go after her again. But in those 2 short years, she had been romanced and was set to wed one of the 3 gravediggers of the Kurgan gang, Andrei Koligov. Lyosha Soldat swept her off her feet anyway and brought her to the Canary Islands on vacation, earning him the woman of his dreams and a death threat from Koligov. It was only Koligov's then recent arrest and the crackdown on the Kurgan gang that kept Koligov from exacting his vengeance at that moment. Lyosha Soldat then had another order come down from his Barcelona beach-loving bosses. Now kill Alexander Tarantsev, the guy you had just killed for. He followed his target for some 4 months and found no holes in Tarantsev's security, so he had to think of a different way of getting to him. The plan developed by Lyosha Soldat was appropriately absurd for an absurd request. He attached a remote control device to a car, allowing him to shoot the target from up close while being far away. When he saw Tarantsev and pressed the button, there was no reaction. Nothing happened. Tarantsev would survive the attack, or attempted attack, and instead the gun suddenly shot a burst of bullets several hours later, when it instead killed a security guard. Now in 1998, the pressure against organized crime in Russia had never been higher, and his interest in being a hitman had never been lower. Lyosha Soldat wanted to start a new life with Irina, so he did. Lyosha Soldat dropped off the radar. He wasn't responding to messages and had disappeared. Osya and the older Pilev brother were too far away to look for him, and Sanich had more important things to worry about. That same year, 1998, new laws against organized crime were first used against the gang. They first tried to bribe the investigator, and when he refused, they killed him. Instead of falling apart, the case against them ramped up to an incredible degree. The crackdown was hard and fast, with most of the members in Moscow getting caught within the next 2 years. Sanich himself had to steal part of the Obshak and flee to Odessa to escape the authorities. The leaders of the gang fell one after the other. Osha and his bodyguard were found in Barcelona in 2001 and were later brought back to Russia. In 2002, Sanich was captured in Odessa. In 2003, Karlik was captured in Spain. During all of this, Lyosha Soldat was as though a ghost. In fact, according to the police, he didn't exist. Throughout his time as a killer, he was never close to the rank and file, only ever to the leadership who were either dead or were sitting in jail cells. Given his disguise skills and constant attempts to deflect from his identity by providing fake DNA samples, Lyosha Soldat was considered to be mythical, simply a mixture of different killers like Alexander Solonik or Sasha Soldat, who had been captured in 2001. Instead, Lyosha Soldat had returned to being Alexei Sherstobatov, just a simple plasterer. He had a simple job and a simple life, but he was in love and happy with his wife, who had become somewhat of a successful model, apparently. Supposedly. There have been some who claim online that he never actually left the criminal life and had been involved in hits and robberies well into the 2000s. Since about 2000, some gangsters who knew of him began to speak of this Lyosha Soldat. Still, the police weren't sure who he was. The more information that they got and the more men they put on trial as the crackdown on the gang continued meant that they gained more and more pieces of information. Yet still, it wasn't enough. In 2005, Andrei Kologov, one of the former heads of the Kurgan gang, demanded suddenly to speak to the authorities. He'd been sentenced to 24 years behind bars in 2002 and wasn't going to see the free world anytime soon. So it was a somewhat surprising request for the cops. As the story goes, Kologov had seen his old love Irina on the cover of a magazine and remembered his old promise to get back at Lyosha Soldat. Armed with this information that Irina was married to a notorious hitman named Lyosha Soldat, the police began to sniff around and collect information. Soon it became clear that this plasterer really was a hitman. February 1st, 2006, while visiting his father in the hospital, Sherstobatov was arrested. When his apartment was searched, they found a small arsenal still in the possession of the ex-hitman. Kologov's plan worked. He had his revenge, but he didn't live to see it. Back on October 1st, 2005, Andrei Kologov was found dead in the prison that he was held at. Some say that he took his own life, but others say that he was killed by old enemies of his. Perhaps he was killed as a rat. Either way, Kologov found a short way out of a long sentence, never able to enjoy his revenge. Alexei Sherstobatov, the man who had become Lyosha Soldat, was sentenced to only 23 years for his crimes. While behind bars, the supposed love of his life divorced him, and he went through another marriage, becoming a minor media figure with a series of books and photoshopped press photos that make him look like a slightly more AI Tom Cruise. He will be released in 2029. It's said that a common refrain of Sergei Timofeev during the height of his power was that those who made it through would live as kings. In the end, they're in hiding, in the ground, or in jail. Lyosha Soldat, in spite of his attempts to become a media figure, didn't turn out any different. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed, please consider subscribing, liking, commenting, and sharing the video. Feel free to check out my Twitch and stream VOD channel. All links are in the description. Without further ado, please check out this video. It's pretty good. Good stories only. Thank you.